Welcome to the first week of December. It is the first weekend of December. Okay, some of you seem alarmed by that. Well, the truth is I come slowly into the Christmas season, usually, The truth is when you work at a church, you can often be so focused on the work of the season that you don't always tie into the reason for the season. It takes a little while, right? My wife, however, Ann, she does not come slowly into the season. The dishes are barely cleared from Thanksgiving when I'm being poked and prodded to put up Christmas lights, which I did, one strand. It's not even plugged in. Friday I went out in the rain and got a Christmas tree. You know these people who post pictures on Facebook of our Christmas tree? What? No, not me. I just drag it in. But something unexpected happened. It happened yesterday. Saturday morning, I'm down in Irvine at Albertsons. My son Austin's got a couple lacrosse games down there, so I've dropped him off early. I'm at Albertsons getting the essentials, sunflower seeds and Gatorade, and it's not that crowded at Albertsons, so I can hear what's going on. I can hear people talking, particularly this one man who was over in the deli section, and he's a small man. He's in a wheelchair. His legs obviously don't work, and he's talking to everybody who comes by. Obviously, some people that he knows, like the store manager comes by, and he grabs him by the hands, and he's just so glad to see him, and he's telling him about the Christmas gift he wants to give him, and then somebody else comes by, and he's talking to them, and then somebody comes out behind the bakery counter and gives him a thing of little mini muffins, and he's just so grateful, and he's all excited, and I tell you what, it worked. I am into the season. Something unexpected. Well, in the same way, we are hoping that God will use something unexpected this Advent season for you, to draw you close to God, to help you engage in the season. And that unexpected thing is silence. When we began to talk about this series with the preaching team and the idea of focusing on silence during Advent, there were some raised eyebrows and some questions and thoughts about, well, how's that going to work? And the way it's going to work is we hope it'll be something unexpected. And in it, you will find some meaning, and it'll draw you to God during this Advent season. So, over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be focusing on how God used silence in some significant ways in 4 of the characters of the Christmas story. Chris Conway and I are going to be walking through some of those stories. And our prayer is that God would use something unexpected, like silence, to help you prepare for the season. And today, we begin with a guy named Zechariah. And we'll be in Luke chapter 1. So if you want to go there with me, Luke chapter 1, verse 5, or you can follow along on the screens. Actually, we're going to be introduced to Zechariah and to his wife Elizabeth, and I think you'll see that they're people who are, well, they're a whole lot like us. Okay, Luke chapter 1. This is verse 5. It says, "In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron." Sounds a lot like us, right? Priests. Okay, not really. They're both from the family line of Aaron. Aaron was Moses' brother. He was also in the tribe of Levi. Levi was one of the 12 tribes or clans, families of people that made up the nation of Israel. And the Levites, the ones who descended from Levi, they were the priests of the nation. So if you were in the family line, you were part of a priestly family. That doesn't sound a whole lot like us, but let's keep reading. Verse 6. "Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all of the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly." Again, sounds a lot like us, right? No, really, there's more here than just a description of their official religious duties. These words describe people who are serious about God. They care about God. Their lives are pointed toward God. They want to serve God. That's probably like a lot of us here. We care about God. We take our relationship with God seriously. We want to point our lives towards God. Well, like us, though, Zechariah and his wife, Elizabeth, they have an issue, a concern, something that's on the very top of their prayer list. Notice what it is in verse 7. But, it says, they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. So this is their issue. This is the thing that dominates their thoughts, their concerns, and their prayers. They are childless. And it's not just that they're married and they've been trying and haven't been able to have a child and it's been a little while. No. Their whole lives, their entire adult lives, they are, the text says, very old. And so they have come to define themselves, and in the text they're certainly described and defined as people who are childless. That's their concern. That's their issue. So they're nice people. They're from a good family. They love God. They've been at that for a while, but the other thing they've been at for a while is this thing of not being able to have children. They are very old. And certainly any married couple who wants to have children but can't, they're faced with a serious issue. But even more so in their culture, where women were so completely defined by whether or not they had children. So this is their issue. It's on the top of their prayer list. It's their number one concern. They're still thinking about it. And in that way, I think they do sound like us. People who want to seek God. People are serious about God. We care about God, right? We want to love and live for God. But we have concerns. Things that occupy our minds and our hearts, our prayer lists. Things that, if the truth be known, they're the things that swirl around in our mind even now. And they may even define our lives at this point. Some of us are childless and we don't want to be, right? Some of us have health concerns, new ones that are going to make a dramatic impact on our future. Others of us are just wondering what in the world God is doing in our lives. Or we're asking, why did our lives turn out like this? Maybe we have concerns about the future, about our jobs, and about what's going to happen. Right? Some of us have things in our lives we haven't been able to overcome yet. Right? Some of us have doubts about immortality or about God or about the Bible. We want to point our lives towards God. We love God. We want to seek God. And even though people from the outside might look at us and say, those people have it all, they're going in the right direction, we know in our hearts we have a concern. We have an issue, something on our prayer list, something we can't overcome. And the truth is it can make it hard for us to get into the season, right? Because our issue rubs off on the rest of our life. We want to be into the season, but our concern about whether or not we'll still be married at the end of the season, it affects us. That concern we have, the burden we have for that child, it affects the way we approach the season. The doubts that we have that for some reason nag us and they don't seem to go away, they make it hard for us to really be into the season. Well, Zechariah was like that. He had an issue. As we move, though, into verse 8, I want you to see how God begins to signal that He's going to interact. He's going to intervene in Zechariah's life. This is verse 8. Once, when Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as priest before God, now this describes what it was like to be from a priestly family. It was sort of like a religious version of the National Guard, okay? They had more priests than they needed to serve in the temple. And so they served on a rotating schedule. And so there were certain weeks during the year where your family would be called up. And you would go to the temple and you would do your priestly duties. So that's what this is describing here. Now, in addition to all the regular things that the people did when they were serving as priests, there was one thing, there was one activity that was a special and high honor. And it's mentioned in verse 9 because Zechariah gets chosen to do it. Verse 9. He was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. So in addition to regular priestly duties, they would draw by lot, which is essentially their way of drawing straws. Someone would get chosen to go into the temple with the incense. The incense represents the prayers of the people being lifted up to God. And somebody got to actually go into the temple and do that. It was a high honor. And so they chose the person by luck or by lot. But what I want you to see here is that this isn't luck. This is the hand of God. That he's not just chosen by lot. God is going to orchestrate something in Zechariah's life, and it begins by making sure he goes into the temple. That's what verse 10 begins to describe. When the time for the burning of incense came, all of the assembled worshipers were praying outside. So everybody's outside, only Zechariah is inside. He's alone, and he's having this very special honor and this cool moment between him and God. He's in the temple with the incense at the altar. All right? And so look what happens. Verse 11. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. Now, I suppose if you're going to have an encounter with an angel, this is a pretty good place for it to happen. Or it's a pretty likely place for it to happen, right? You're in the temple at the altar. And that's what happens to Zechariah. He's about to be touched by an angel. And it's an indication that God is on the move in his life. Look what happens. Verse 12. When Zechariah saw him, he was startled and he was gripped with fear. And that's totally normal. In the Bible, when people encounter angels, they're scared to death. Okay? It's not like our cute little figurines that we put on our shelves or the little bumper stickers we have that say angels are watching over us and it's real cute. No. When an angel appears to you in the Bible, you fall over like you're dead. Okay? You're scared. It's a frightening experience. So the angel has to now speak to Zechariah, and he's going to say the same thing that angels always have to say to people. It's the first thing. The angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Don't worry. It's not as bad as you think. Don't be afraid." But then notice those next words. Your prayer has been heard. Your prayer has been heard. Not the little prayer, not the random prayer, not the one you lifted up before breakfast this morning, not that prayer, but the prayer, your prayer, the number one thing on your prayer list. It's been heard. That issue that is the answer for you when the question is, what do you want more than anything? That prayer. God's heard it. He's heard your prayer. Now, Zechariah's issue, you'll remember, is that he was childless. He'd lived his whole adult life. His wife was not able to have children. They had no kids. God has heard that prayer. Your wife, it says, Elizabeth, will bear you a son. You're not just going to have a kid, you're going to have a son, right? That's how his dads sometimes feel. And you are to call him John. John. Now, this is very significant. Your wife, the one who's very old, she's going to have a child, and you will name him John. Hang on to that. That's going to become important later in our story. So this is a pretty amazing step by God into Zechariah's life through the angel. God has heard your prayer. The number one thing on your prayer list, God is going to address. You're going to receive it. But there's more. Verse 14, he will be a joy and a delight to you. Well, of course, right? And many will rejoice because of his birth. You aren't going to be the only ones who are excited about this child. Lots of people are going to rejoice when this child is born. And the reasons are given in verse 15. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord. Now, we all think our kids are great, right? This kid's really going to be great. I mean, in the sight of God, he's going to be great. And then notice these words. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink. Those are the kinds of words that refer to taking a vow. The kind of vow a prophet would take. He's going to be set aside for special service to God. This child, he's going to be great. He's going to be a prophet. And he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he is born. What a child. But there's more. This child, the son you're going to have, he will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God. So the people of Israel in Zechariah's day, they were far from God. They'd wandered. They were scattered. One of the reasons is because it's been 400 years since anybody's heard from God. The people of Israel, their history is full of kings and priests and prophets, people who were spoken to and spoken through by God. But nobody's heard a word for 400 years. And so one of the results of that is the people have wandered. And now this angel speaks to Zechariah and says, your son is going to be the one who starts bringing people back to God. In verse 17 it says, he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah. Okay, if we were talking football, this would be like saying, your son, he's going to go in the spirit and power of Elway. That's what we say in Colorado, anyway. It's big stuff. To turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. And those are all words that tie into words that the prophets gave about what would happen when Messiah came. Your wife is going to have a son, Zechariah, but he's not just going to be a son for you. He's going to be a son that God uses in a great way. He's going to be a prophet. He's going to draw people back to God. He's going to be the one who prepares the way for the coming of the Lord. You and I will know him as John the Baptist, the baptizer, the one who prepares the way for the Lord. That's a pretty dramatic event. God has orchestrated him being in the temple to hear this angel say this about speaking to his number one issue. The thing he wants more than anything. The thing that dominates his prayer list and his concern. God has heard it and he's going to speak to it. Imagine for a moment this morning what it would be like if God directly addressed you and said, your prayer has been heard. That thing, the thing that you say, I would trade it all for this, that thing, God's heard. And you're going to get it. He's going to do it. Imagine that. And then imagine for a moment what it would be like this morning to be very old and told you were having a child. Okay? Because that's what sort of fills Zechariah's thoughts. Notice what he says in response to this dramatic statement. Zechariah asked the angel, how can I be sure of this? I mean, I'm an old man, and my wife, she's well along in years. Well, that sounds pretty normal and rational, don't you think? I mean, he hears this angel say these dramatic things about him having a child, his wife becoming pregnant, and he's saying, okay, he's trying to take it all in, and he's just sort of wondering about this. How is this going to happen? How can I get my arms around this, right? I mean, Zechariah was a rational being like us. He knows that people who are very old, who are well along in years, they don't have children very often. So how can I know this? That's what it sounds. Maybe to you and I, it sounds perfectly normal. When Ann and I were told we had 4 boys, and then one day we were told we were going to have a girl. We didn't believe it, okay? Really, we did not believe it. But the thing is, we just didn't believe an ultrasound. Zechariah doesn't believe an angel. You say, well, wait a minute. It just sort of sounds like Zechariah's processing. He's asking, he's wondering, how can this be? But you're going to see in a moment how when Zechariah says these things, what he's really saying, I don't believe it. I can't believe it. I can't believe that God is really going to address my number one issue. And I don't know why he didn't believe it. But maybe it had something to do with the noise. All of the noise in his life. It could have been the noise of his own voice. You know, the things that he told himself, he had to tell himself all of those years just so he could handle the disappointment of not having children. You know, maybe Zechariah had told himself, you know, the reason that I can't have children is because of something that I did when I was younger, and this is the consequence. Or God knows I wouldn't be a good dad, and so that's why I don't have kids. Something that he told himself over and over again all of those years just so he could try and cope. And when you do that for long enough, it fills your mind. It's hard to see around it. Maybe it was the noise of his culture. A culture where if you didn't have children, there was something wrong with you. And every time there was a party, every time there was a gathering, there would be the looks and the whispers and the comments from people about why they didn't have children. And maybe it was just the noise of his wife's weeping. As she watched her friends have their children, and now their grandchildren, but not her. Well, whatever it was louder than the angel's voice. And he didn't believe it. Some of us are probably right there. You know, even if God spoke directly to our number one issue, we'd have a hard time believing it. We get so caught up in the noise of our lives and of our world that it's hard for us to believe. Even in things we want to believe in, like Christmas, you know? But the thought that this unseen God stepped into our world in the form of a baby born to a virgin, nonetheless, and that somehow this event allows me to connect with God and it speaks to my number one issue, that can be a little hard to believe. Especially when there's so much noise in my world, so many voices, so many places and people telling me that can't be true. And the noise of my own life that hasn't turned out the way I'd hoped it would, or the circumstances I'm experiencing, or the things that I've seen, that they all scream at me, this can't be true. And it makes it hard to believe, even in Christmas. We'd like to believe, but it's hard. We're not much different than Zechariah. The noise of our lives can make it hard for us to believe, even in Christmas. And so what's the remedy? What's the remedy when we find it hard to believe or when our faith needs a little help? We're going to see that this morning as we talk about now the angel's response to Zechariah. This is verse 19. The angel said to him, I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and tell you this good news. That's how he said it, right? I mean, in the Christmas plays, that's how he says it. I like to imagine Gabriel responding to Zechariah maybe a little more like this when Zechariah says, how can I know this is true? Really? Really? I'm Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God. I've been sent from there to here to give you this good news. My next assignment is to go tell a teenage virgin she's going to have a baby. At least you're married. You have to feel sorry for angels, you know, dealing with humans. Then he delivers a blow. Verse 20. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their appointed time. And so Zechariah is plunged into silence. You will be silent until the day this happens. This refers back to verse 13, where it says, your wife will give birth to a son, and you will name him John. Until those two things happen, you're silent. No talking. And the reason is right there, because you did not believe. Not because you wondered. Not because you tried to grasp what this would mean in your life. It's because you did not believe. And that sounds sort of harsh, at least to me, until you realize that this isn't punishment. Zechariah is not plunged into silence as a punishment for not believing. He's plunged into silence as an opportunity to believe, to regain his faith, to regrow his faith. That's the purpose of the silence. When we enter into silence, we're better able to hear and to see the work of God. It is in silence that we have the opportunity to regrow, to renew our faith. And that's what the angel is providing for Zechariah. Think for a moment about all of the things that Zechariah would have seen and heard during his silence, which probably lasted about 9 months, right? Think about that for a moment. He cannot talk, but he can still see. And down in verse 24, notice what he would have seen. It says, after this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant, and for 5 months remained in seclusion. After this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant. He would have seen this. Imagine him in silence, being very old, watching his wife's belly grow day after day. And what that would have done inside. Well, it's not just his eyes that still worked, his ears still worked too. Imagine what he would have heard. One of the things he would have heard is, do you remember the account of Mary, who is Elizabeth's relative, who is also pregnant, who comes to visit her? You remember that? And then they have this exchange. This is what Zechariah would have heard.
Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the child you will bear. But why am I so favored that the mother of my Lord should come to me? As soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. Blessed is she who has believed that the Lord would fulfill his promises to her.
My soul glorifies in the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has been mindful of the humble state of his servant. From now on, all generations will call me blessed, for the Mighty One has done great things in me. Holy is his name.
And Zechariah would have heard this. He would have heard this amazing testimony of God's work in the lives of these two women. And it would have soaked in. And it wasn't confused with his words, the noise of his life, his thoughts saying, I don't believe it. I can't believe it. This can't be true, because he's silent. And so let's see the effect that all of this would have on Zechariah's faith as we jump down to verse 57, where the story becomes complete. In verse 57, it says, when it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. It happened. Her neighbors and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. Remember, the angel said, he'll be a delight to you, but also to many. Many will rejoice in the birth of this child. And so here it is. The whole neighborhood has come. All of the family has gathered. And there's this celebration over the fact that Elizabeth, who couldn't have children, now has a baby. And it's a boy. And so there's this community celebration. There's probably a lot of noise. But no word from Zechariah. Verse 59, on the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father, Zechariah. 8 days go by after the birth of the baby. No word from Zechariah. And so the family and the neighborhood, they do what they would normally do. They take this boy to be circumcised on the 8th day, and that's the day they would give him his name. And so Zechariah can't speak, so the family just sort of takes over. Do you have relatives like that? They just butt in and say, let's get this kid named, right? And obviously, he's going to take a family name. He's going to be Zechariah Jr., right? That would be normal, especially in a family like this where this was probably going to be the only child, right? So we're going to name this kid. Let's get it going, Zechariah Jr. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the commotion, Elizabeth speaks up. But his mother spoke up and said, no! He's to be called John. We're going with John. John. And they said to her, there's no one among your relatives who has that name. You cannot name this kid John. That's crazy. We gotta do something. Zechariah, things are going crazy. They're going to name your kid John. Let's do something about it, right? My favorite part, verse 62. Then they made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child. So Zechariah can't talk. And so they do what we often do in cases like this. Zechariah, what do you want to name the baby? And Zechariah's like, ay. You can hear. So he asked for a writing tablet, and to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, his name is John. He put it right there on his iPad. It says tablet right there. You think I make this stuff up? His name is John. And then notice what happens. Immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue set free, and he began to speak, praising God. But it doesn't happen until the moment that Zechariah declares his name is John. It's not the name they should name the kid. It's the name the angel gave. And when Zechariah says his name is John, he's demonstrating that he believes. His faith has been reborn. He's back. And he believes. The silence worked. And so he breaks his silence and he begins to praise God because what he said would be true and because of the opportunity he has been given to renew his faith. And that's what it was for. You know, in silence, we can renew and we can reaffirm our faith. When we enter before God into silence, we can regain it. Arsenius was a desert father. He lived in the 4th or 5th century A.D. And he said this, I have often repented of having spoken, but never of having remained silent. And part of what that means is when I'm always talking, it's hard to hear God. God can and He does use silence to renew our faith. And silence became a part of my walk with God during a time in my life when I simply didn't have anything to say. It's been almost 20 years since Ann and I had the soul-shattering experience of taking our 3-year-old son, Brian, into the hospital and never bringing him home. He had a massive tumor that was enmeshed throughout his whole brain. It was undetected. We didn't know until the very end. He essentially got very sick one day, and he died the next. And I remember leaving the hospital and coming to the elevator and waiting for those doors to open and thinking, this doesn't make sense. And for a long time after Brian died, I didn't have anything to say. To God, to my wife, to my church. We were 1 year into planting a new church in Corona. And I can remember I would go into my den with my Bible, and I wanted to say something to God, but I just didn't have anything to say. And so I would just sit there, silent. And I would go to my office, and I would go in, and I would close the door, and I wouldn't say anything. I wouldn't talk to anyone. I wouldn't answer the phone. I just stared at the wall. And at the end of the day, I would go home. Day after day, weeks, months. I didn't have anything to say. And we were very blessed to be surrounded by some really great people who allowed that. And they also had a lot of things to say, a lot of words of encouragement or advice. There were books to be read, but somehow in that time I blocked all of that out. I didn't hear any of it. I was just silent. And slowly, with my faith hanging there in the balance, in that silence, I began to hear the still, small voice of God, slowly. And over time, in the silence, I was led from what was a very, very dark place into a place of confidence and trust and faith. But I don't know that it would have happened without the silence. Because God, in the silence, has access to our hearts in a way that He doesn't when we're always talking or when there's always noise around us. Will you willingly enter into silence? You don't have to be plunged into silence like Zechariah. You can choose to sit before God in silence. And when you do, you will begin to hear the still small voice of God, and your faith will grow. It'll be reborn if it's necessary. It'll be renewed. And so let's practice silence during Advent as a means to renew or to reaffirm our faith. And coming in here on Sundays during the Advent season, that alone will be good. Come in from all the noise in your life. Come here just for a few minutes. Be silent. But let me also encourage you to make some room for silence in the rest of your life this month. Maybe on the way to work this month, you'll be silent instead of whatever you normally do. Or maybe on your day of worship or your day of Sabbath or your weekend, you'll devote just a little bit of time to silence, to listening, to letting God speak to your issue. Ruth Haley Barton is an author, and she compares what happens in our souls when we focus on God in silence to sediment that is swirling in the water. And she says, when we sit quietly in God's presence, the sediment that is swirling around in our lives, in our souls, begins to settle. And we don't have to do anything but show up and trust the spiritual law of gravity that says, be still, and the knowing will come. God wants to use silence. He's inviting you into silence as an opportunity to grow your faith. Will you come? I'm going to pray for us. And after I pray, we're going to be silent for a little bit. Maybe a minute or two. It'll feel like an hour. But let's just practice. And maybe you're cognizant, you know what your issue is, you know what the number one thing on your prayer list is, and maybe you want to reflect that to God. Maybe you don't, and you just want to let God direct your thoughts. Let's just take a moment or two to do that. And then when we're done, I'll lead us in prayer. So let's begin, though, by praying this. God, in silence we come. Settle our souls. Help us to hear the still small voice.